Welcome to the Political Brief. I'm Molly Hall. Mark's away on assignment. Here's what's coming up in this week's edition. French labor reforms face another wave of opposition, but will it be enough to make the president change course? Plus, the Senate gears up for fresh elections. Florence Villeminot breaks down the political chamber. And the role of Prime Minister can be a tough balancing act here in France. We look at Edouard Philippe's take on the job. Now, it's a familiar sight here in France. Thousands of people on the streets to protest labor reform. After last week, another wave of demonstrations are taking place this week. Workers and trade unionists marching against President Emmanuel Macron's measures.
If we have to block the whole country, no problem, we'll do it. If we have to go on strike like in '95, if the rail workers and employees are with us, we'll do it. And students should also strike.
Of course it's worse than Hollande. Hollande didn't do anything. Macron's rolled up his sleeves to impose something that's bad for workers and good for companies.
Reform decree, if they want to, have the right to protest, and they have to protest.
Now, as you just heard there, many want to keep the pressure on the government to force it to change its bid, this to make work laws more flexible. The government plans to adopt the new measures by decree by the end of this week. Now, in a new poll by French daily Libération, 60% of people think the reform will increase job insecurity, and 68% think it favors firing. But interestingly, only 30% want to strike. Well, indeed, turnout has appeared lower than in previous years. The far-left CGT union says some 400,000 people marched across France last week. That's down from its estimate for 2016 of 1.2 million. But the far-left union is not done fighting. They've called for a second day of protests and hope the social movements will snowball into a bargaining chip. Now, joining the demonstrations this coming weekend will be Jean-Luc Mélenchon and his France Unsubmissive movement. Now, Mélenchon has called the president's reforms a social coup d'etat, and he's positioning himself as the voice of government opposition. But this year's election exposed fault lines in the left, and Mélenchon trying to take the lead, but not everyone's following. Well, the head of the National Communist Party criticizing Mélenchon after he was a no-show at Fête de l'Humanité. That's a key annual leftist gathering.
One man by himself cannot bring the left together. It means bringing people together. Some people have not come, and it's their loss because it's a great party, and it's going to give us a boost.
Here in France, the power ultimately lies with the president, but the prime minister is the head of government. The job can be a tough balancing act. We look at Edouard Philippe's take on the task.
France's prime minister is stepping out of the shadows. In the past week, Edouard Philippe has been constantly present in the media, traveling across France and abroad to defend his government's labor reforms. A change of pace for a man who had until recently remained in the background.
We need to explain, to embody the changes. Obviously, it's not an easy task.
Speaking for the president without overstepping their bounds. A delicate balance that many French prime ministers have failed to uphold, with their sense of responsibility often blurred by ambition.
We've seen in the past that when the prime minister wants to be president, things didn't go well. It led to tensions, time was lost, traps were laid out. It just didn't work.
Edouard Philippe says he harbors no presidential ambitions and simply sees himself as the conductor to Emmanuel Macron's symphony. Another challenge for Edouard Philippe will be to lead an extremely diverse and largely inexperienced political majority, something the Prime Minister is intent on doing his own way.
I'm not a leader who imposes, dictates or orders, but rather someone who guides, encourages and explains. That's the role I see myself having.
A difficult task for the man who's still officially a member of the conservative Les Républicains party, but who must now speak for Emmanuel Macron's centrist République en Marche. As he moves into the spotlight, Edouard Philippe will need to show that he can be his own man without stepping on the president's toes.
And as you just heard in that report, Edouard Philippe will be leading a group of inexperienced ruling party MPs. Now, many of them not only in parliament for the first time, but also newcomers to politics. Over 300 elected representatives got together for a crash course in how to do their job.
I brought some beers.
Just like students on their first day of class.
I wanted them to try something new.
Bringing regional specialties to share with their fellow members of parliament and build team spirit.
This is a typical drink of Normandy.
75% of them have never been members of parliament before, so receiving proper training is essential.
Indeed, I need to learn the codes and how the National Assembly works.
And so they gathered in a conference room on the outskirts of Paris, behind closed doors and with just a few pictures as proof. The need to learn is clear, but their leader, Richard Ferrand, often criticized for his lack of fighting spirit, denies the mistakes made over the summer.
People pointed the finger at us, but it was unfair. We believe the work we did during the special parliamentary session shows we're able to act. The goal here is to get to know each other better.
They're also accused of being Emmanuel Macron's foot soldiers. That's not how they see it.
We voted with our convictions. We're not foot soldiers. We have discussions, we agree on many things, but mostly we voted for things that we believe in.
We're not going to repeat what happened in the previous presidency when there were dissidents. We're not here for that.
One attendee did raise eyebrows as he walked in without saying a word to the press. Former Prime Minister Manuel Valls, who joined Macron's ranks. After a difficult summer in the polls, the majority's aim is to show its unity with the president.
Well, 2017 has been a busy electoral year, and France is gearing up for yet another vote, this time to renew just about half of the seats in the Senate. Florence Villeminot joins me now for more on this.
Hey,
so, Flo, what exactly are we going to see this Sunday?
French senators are elected for 6-year terms, but every 3 years, elections are held to renew about half of the seats in parliament, and the roll of the dice means that those senatorial elections are taking place in 2017, the perfect storm of all election years. Now, this year, 171 of the chamber's 348 red velvet seats are up for election. It's an important election, but it's somewhat overlooked, but you would be forgiven for not paying attention because not a majority of French people are actually going to vote in this election. And what's happening in France is similar to what you see in the Electoral College in the United States. That means that senators are not directly elected by French citizens. They're actually elected by other elected officials. They're called les grands électeurs, the big elected officials, I guess you could say. There are about 162,000 of them. They are essentially regional and departmental councillors, mayors, members of the National Assembly, so the lower house of parliament. They're the ones who elect the senators. So unlike the president and the members of the lower house of parliament, they're not directly elected by universal suffrage.
Now, we hear all the time then about the lower house of parliament, not so much about the upper house. So walk us through, what exactly does the Senate do?
Well, cynics would say the Senate doesn't do that much, but of course that's an exaggeration. The Senate does have some very important missions that you'll see right here. First of all, the Senate represents something called les collectivités locales. These are decentralized local and regional authorities. You can see the second mission there, legislation. Of course, the Senate is a legislative assembly, and it votes on laws put forward either by the government or the lower house of parliament. It has 7 standing committees to examine these laws, and it too can actually introduce bills as well. You can see the third mission there, a very important one. Keep a check on the government, make sure that it's doing what it said it would do. And that fourth mission there, amend the Constitution. This is a mission it can only do hand in hand with the lower house of parliament. When the lower house and the upper house meet in a Congress, then they can vote amendments to the Constitution.
What about power? How much power does the Senate have when compared to the lower house?
Well, in many ways, the upper house of parliament really has a lot less power than the lower house of parliament, the Assemblée nationale, because the Senate tries to influence laws, influence writing of laws, etc., but the lower house always has the final word when it comes to discussions about law. So in this way, the Senate has less power than the Assemblée nationale. That being said, though, the Senate is the guarantor of the stability of French institutions. So unlike the Assemblée nationale, the lower house of parliament, the Senate, so the upper house of parliament, cannot be dissolved. And on top of that, if the president of the republic decides to go on vacation or is otherwise indisposed, well, it's the president of the Senate who's provisionally in charge.
So then what should we expect this coming Sunday?
Well, traditionally, the Senate has largely been the domain, I guess you could say, of graying male politicians. Currently, 3/4 of the Senate are older men, I guess you could say. The average age is 64, for instance, and that's unlikely to change in this coming election. Even though people as young as 24 years old can run in this election, it's likely going to remain mainly old and male. That being said, what's interesting is in this election, there's actually a record number of candidates, about, nearly 2,000 candidates. But the thing is, only 5.4% of them are women at the top of these lists. So in a way, what's pretty incredible is there could be a lower number of women senators following this election. Now, as for the political makeup of the Senate, it's unlikely to change much either. It's probably going to stay very conservative because that's the way the Senate has been for the past couple of years. Why is that? Well, remember, senators are elected by these grands électeurs, this electoral college that are local and regional elected officials. And remember, conservatives did well in the 2014 municipal election and in the 2015 departmental election. So they're the ones that are voting for these senators, and so they're probably going to vote for people that are quite conservative. So that means that Emmanuel Macron and his La République en Marche, that winning streak that we saw in the presidential election and in the parliamentary election for l'Assemblée nationale, that winning streak might come to a halt in the senatorial elections.
All right, well, once again, that's on Sunday. Flo, thank you very much for breaking things down there for us in the upper house of Parliament. And that's all we have time for. Thanks for joining us. We will see you again next week on The Political Brief.